Welcome to Taking the Edge Off the Middle East, a series of casual conversations that offer a rare insider knowledge on the most important events in the broader Middle East and why it matters to America today. I'm Brian Katulis, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, and today I'm joined by Frank Lowenstein, former special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations in the Obama administration. A brief message to our listeners. We're excited to announce that Taking the Edge Off the Middle East is launching its own independent channel after more than a year of being hosted by our colleagues here at Middle East Focus. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Be sure to follow, review, and subscribe. Your support makes all of this possible. Frank, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to see you. We've known each other for years.
Yep.
We talked earlier. You tried to hire me at one point. I resisted your overtures. But you've had a wonderful career beyond serving as one of the most senior advisors to Secretary of State John Kerry at a key moment that we'll talk about, the attempts to bring Israelis and Palestinians together. But let's start with where we are today, about 2+ months into the second Trump administration. What's your basic assessment of how the Trump administration is approaching the Middle East? What's good, if anything? What's bad? What concerns you? Where's it all going?
Yeah. Well, again, thank you very much for having me, Brian. It's really a pleasure to be here. The Trump administration has a very different set of capabilities and opportunities than the Biden administration had or the Obama administration had, in the sense that they seem completely unconstrained by politics, right? The way I think we always felt under Obama, and I'm sure they felt under
by domestic
politics here in the United States. So Trump can do things like essentially pressure Netanyahu into accepting a ceasefire agreement for Gaza that Bibi had been resisting for 9 months under the Obama administration. All the issues that Bibi said, I will never give up on this, and it's our own corridor and whatnot. It always seemed like there was another reason why he couldn't do the deal. Trump came in and said, Witkoff goes, I'm meeting you on Shabbat, and I don't want to hear any more of your excuses for. So at that moment in time, there was a sense of, okay, Trump is able to do things that Biden was unable to do.
Right.
And it's all about, with Trump, of course, it's his personal agenda. What is Donald Trump? What's in this for Donald Trump? His narrative is that he ends endless wars and he gets hostages home. So there was a notion that, wow, if he's really willing to leverage, right, the Israelis in furtherance of his own interest, that could coincide with what Biden was aiming to do, which was to use a ceasefire agreement to really bring an end to the war.
Right.
So there was a moment in time there where it really felt like Trump could move ahead with a process to end that war that would otherwise have been impossible. So that was an exciting time in a sense. And I did a bunch of different TV interviews on it. And I was like, listen, you got to give the guys credit for it. They're not constrained in some of the ways that we were. And maybe they're going to be able to do some stuff that Biden would never have been able to do. So there was a period where it really did feel like things might change.
So this is like January, February, right?
Yeah. Well, so right. The ceasefire agreement was even before Trump took office.
In January 19th.
Yeah. Like they got that done before Trump was even in office. And, there's a sense that he might really be committed. They owned this ceasefire in a sense that they were the ones that drove Netanyahu to accept. So, that was relatively short-lived, unfortunately. Not too long after that, he came out with this Gaza Riviera plan, which was, and I don't think he quite understood just how neuralgic that concept is to people throughout the Middle East, not just the people in Gaza who obviously had a terrible, tragic history of being, dislocated from their homes going back to the 48 war. And then, no way that the Arab world was ever going to facilitate that sort of process, nor did hundreds of thousands of people want to leave Gaza. The end result of it was we lost all our credibility in that region. It's a little bit like if your kid comes to you and says, hey, Dad, can I gamble my life saving or my college fund in Las Vegas? And you're like, first of all, like, no.
Right.
But the fact that you even asked that question raises some serious questions of your judgment.
So you think there's doubts across the region about Trump because of what he put out, that video he put on Truth Social and other things?
I think anybody who's worked in that region for a long time, as I know you have, would know that was the very concept of it was fundamentally offensive to people who thought, and also completely non-serious. Right? There was no way that was actually going to be a policy in the real world. And the fact that he suggested it really created whatever credibility we had on the ceasefire going forward. So it felt to me like it was a real missed opportunity, at least with respect to the Gaza war. And since then, what we've seen is the Trump guys basically, brought Netanyahu the White House and said, "Hey, let's do this Gaza Riviera plan." And at that point, Netanyahu then was under no pressure to implement phase 2 of the ceasefire, which had been the original plan. But now the sort of the fever dream of the extreme right in Israel, which is to take all of Gaza for themselves, to resettle it, and then to kick off. Suddenly that became a policy reality. And I think we've seen that manifested now in Netanyahu's posture with respect to negotiations and his unwillingness to come up with any kind of a meaningful day after plan. So there were beyond the optics of it and beyond the loss of credibility, that had a significant impact on the policy on the ground that set us in exactly the opposite direction that I think a lot of us hoped we were heading.
So it motivated those on the far right in Israel to say, okay, we have this dream, maybe we can actually realize it. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, 100%. And they were Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir and some of the real sort of messianic, greater Israel extremists over there. They wouldn't even dare to say this out loud, right? It's like, because no one wants to, some people do, but most people don't want to leave Gaza voluntarily. So the question was, could you make life so unbearable for them that they would eventually just be forced to leave? Right. But they really didn't say that out loud because it was really too extreme of a position for anybody to articulate. I'm sure they said it in Hebrew and private and that kind of thing. But so suddenly Trump said they were exultant.
So he normalized it. Do you think this was part of his plan? Or was this, so I've written that Trump is like the ultimate improv actor or performer. Yeah. He gets up there and he doesn't really know where it's going. Yeah. Or you look at the fact that Mike Huckabee is his nominee from the get-go. He was one of his early named nominees to be ambassador to Israel. And Mike Huckabee is well known not to be a big proponent of the two-state solution, something you were working for.
Yeah. I thought for a little while that this was right out of the Trump playbook in the sense of you suggest something so outlandish, right, that when you do something that is merely extreme, it seems reasonable in comparison. And I thought where that was headed was annexation, which is something that Mike Huckabee, before he was even the ambassador, was saying, yes, of course, we're going to allow Israel to annex whatever they want in the West Bank. So I thought that there was a scenario where there was a method to that madness, to throw out this crazy idea of creating, Cancun and Gaza. And then when you just allow Israel to annex significant parts of the West Bank, it seems like, okay, that's, at least that's kind of here on planet Earth. Thing. So,
great. What about other files? Iran, Syria? I know you've done a lot of work on Syria. Where do you think they're going on at least those two big issues?
Well, the Iran thing is really interesting to me. Again, I think that the Trump plan is to be a disruptor. I think you were saying this to me the other day, Rhonda, to be unpredictable, right? And he has a concept that by making extreme demands far beyond what anybody would normally expect in a negotiation, then he'll get more than he otherwise would have gotten. So I think with respect to Iran, he's trying to do both: threaten military force in a very direct way. It's all hell. Everything's going to be as hell, and Gaza's going to be hell to pay in Iran, and then ratchet up the economic pressure in hopes that he can get Iran to agree to a deal that he could at least argue was better than the JCPOA, which Obama and Kerry obviously negotiated. So the question is, when you're making these threats, right? So the basic premise behind is you scare people, you bully people. And so at some point, somebody says, no, and the Iranians already said, like, we're not doing that deal with you. So the question is, does Trump follow through then, right? Because he doesn't want to start a whole nother war with Iran. He knows that if that he can give Israel the weapons to do it, which Biden probably wasn't willing to do, but then it's still a war that's eventually going to drag us back into it in one form or another. Right. So then Trump's bullying tactics start butting up against his actual policy notions. And so I think if the Iranian, my hope, I think all of our hope, is that they can sit down and negotiate a deal that resolves the nuclear question in a peaceful manner, because there's no question, it is a very alarming situation over there right now. The red lines, remember Bibi went before the UN and he had to bother, like, we can't allow Iran to get, I think at the point it was a year. We can't allow Iran to be under a year in terms of how long it would take them to enrich the uranium stockpiles, have 2 weapons grade. Now it's a week. It might be 4 or 5 days. So it's a legitimate problem. The question is there a diplomatic solution to this thing that Trump could be persuaded to actually negotiate with him? Because what he doesn't do is listen to the other side. And look at his efforts at Middle East peace during the first term. And there was some of that stuff that honestly I was impressed with. They got a map out of the Israelis. That was further than we ever got.
Right.
but he never talked to the Palestinians about it. And he just doesn't really understand the concept of making concessions in negotiations. So I hope this strategy works. I'm a little bit skeptical, to put it mildly, that Trump has the wherewithal or the inclination to actually sit down and negotiate a deal with Iran where he would be required to make concessions, because his deals are always, I get everything I want, and you get whatever I'm willing to give you.
One more question on the Iran file is, one thing I've seen in my work is that the position of the Arab Gulf states today in 2025 ain't what it was when you were in office in the second Obama term when it relates to Iran.
Yeah.
Back then, they were saying, cut off the head of the snake.
Oh, yeah.
This is a huge threat. Now, they're very much, I joke with some Gulf friends of mine, officials and others, you sound like Code Pink. You sound like MoveOn.org. You want to de-escalate with Iran, and they laugh too, but it's a different mindset. Do you agree with that? And if so, do you think that they actually could and should be? Because the Obama team, and I know you weren't part of the Iran team, but you were close with them, really didn't consult that much with those regional partners.
Yeah.
And whether they could actually help produce some sort of accommodation, some win set here between the different Venn diagrams here, the circles of them.
I think it's a great point, Brian. I think that is very much so. I can remember going to a meeting with Hosni Mubarak by in 2010.
The president of Egypt.
The president of Egypt at the time. And he was saying to Kerry, you must go bomb Iran immediately. And Kerry was like, if we go bomb Iran, you'll be the first guy out on the streets condemning us for this, military assault. And Mubarak said, of course I would, and I wouldn't beat a word of it. So back then there was a lot of sort of pushing the United States into military action,
right? But not them.
But now in the region, you've seen there's been some degree of rapprochement between the Saudis and the Iranians. I think over in the region they would like to avoid more disruption. Right, there is an opportunity really to reset the region right now with the collapse of Iran's proxies in Lebanon and in Syria, and I think the deck has been reshuffled over there in a way that really creates some new opportunities. And I think those in the region would like to have calm in order to see if they could build up the government in Lebanon, create a government in Syria that might be, I don't know whether a democracy is a realistic outcome there, but responsive to the needs of the people and stable.
Right.
And so I think that I think you're exactly right. There may be, if the Trump administration is willing to work with those in the region, I know the Emiratis are influential with them. And of course, the Saudis, they listen to this as Trump still wants to do normalization, which we can do it. But if the Saudis are in his ear saying, hey, find a peaceful way to resolve, and they're willing to do back channel negotiations. If the Omanis started off that process, I think others would be involved and try to figure out the way to solve this problem peacefully. So hopefully that dynamic will help Trump to go down the path of peaceful negotiations. A little hard to envision the outcome there, but
right. So there's a pathway, but you're a little skeptical that they'll be willing and able to.
Well, yeah, it was like negotiate the JCPOA, and that was just an incredibly difficult, long, technical discussion, and concessions needed to be made to Iran, right, in order to get them to agree to that deal. I just have real questions about whether they have the technical or the inclination to make any kind of concession. So I hope so. Anyway,
just a quick minute on Syria. I know it's a complicated topic. It's one you worked on when you were at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee with Secretary Kerry, and then outside of government, and then in government, you have some knowledge of it as well, obviously, as you traveled with the secretary back then. Where do you see things today, and what's the opportunity for America today in Syria?
Yeah, we spent a lot of time in Syria in 2008, right before the Arab Spring, and we were there 4 or 5 times. Kerry and I were oftentimes completely off the books. Obama and Dennis Ross asked Kerry to go talk to Bashar al-Assad to see if there was a way to get the Syrians to be more in the camp of the moderate Sunni countries. They were never going to be Jordan,
right?
But we're hoping to move them away from the orbit of Iran. And so the question was, what can you offer the Syrians in return for that?
And what were those meetings like? What was it like meeting Bashar al-Assad? Was it like his father, Hafez al-Assad, which was reported that he'd have Warren Christopher there for 7 or 8 hours? But give us a little flavor of what that was.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly. We would go and sit in the palace with Bashar and just one of his advisors, Butena Saban normally, or Walid Muallim was the foreign minister. And it'd just be me and Kerry, and we would sit there for 4, 5, 6 hours and have conversations. As I was mentioning earlier, Kerry views every American foreign policy problem as somebody else's domestic policy issue. So we spent a lot of time trying to understand what were the dynamics like for Assad. What did he
inside of Syria?
So obviously, the number one goal of any leader is to stay in power. So try to understand what is it that Assad needs. And we finally asked Moallem and Chancellor, like, what is it and they said, listen, he needs to give more jobs to the people of Syria, or this country's going to collapse, right? And I remember very clearly, Moallem said, if we don't create more jobs for people in Syria, you come back here in 5 years and he'll be Mullah Assad, right? Because the religious types will eventually overwhelm the system if they can't provide jobs. So that was the premise of it. We give them sanctions relief. They could create a more robust economy, give jobs to the people, and maybe that would move them in closer into alignment with ours, or at least not be directly in opposition to what we were trying.
So wait, this is in 2008, because a lot of that sounds a lot like what we're talking about today in 2025. The need for jobs, sanctions relief, the fear that different mullahs and extremists might take over, questions of whether who's in charge now are, or whether, same.
100%, Brian. Yeah, you understand speaking. So eventually it all comes back around to the beginning again. So we tried. And, the argument was basically to Bashar that Kerry would make is, listen, Qatar, right, provides millions of dollars a year, right, to Hamas, as we all know. And they're one of our closest allies in the region. All you do is transit weapons from Iran to Hezbollah, and you're a state sponsor of terror. Like, what are you getting out of this?
Right.
There's no reason why you should be pursuing Iran's agenda, right, at the expense of your own. Anyway, so we thought we were really making some progress on that, and then I remember Dennis McDonough pulled us aside in the skiff back when we used to use.
He was a deputy national security advisor at the time.
I think he was White House. Whatever. Chief of staff. Anyway, but back when we treated classified information in classified facilities,
not on the signal
thing in the past. But he pulled us aside and he showed us some imagery that showed that that Syria was doing the same thing it had always done before.
They hadn't. Those discussions, they changed their behavior.
It did not change behavior.
Why do you think that is?
So I'll tell you, this is actually true. We stopped off in Jordan on the way back from one of those meetings in Syria, and Kerry asked King Abdullah, I said, Your Majesty, I don't understand. Why is Syria not willing to see reason here? Assad has told us himself he needs sanctions relief. He needs a and Abdullah said, well, John, think of it this way. You go in to see Assad and you offer him a poo-poo platter. There's some mushu pork, a few dumplings in there. And he's like, then the Iranians go in and they offer him a sumptuous feast with, thousands, like a whole roof. And it's like, and then they threaten them, right? So it's like they can provide many more incentives and disincentives. We just didn't have that kind
We weren't deeply engaged on all of these issues. This is fascinating. Let me hit the rewind button, back to your experience. We talked a little bit about Syria, but let's go to the Middle East peace process and the experience that you had in the Obama administration. Now, you had recommended to me when we were talking about this that I should take a look at Every Day is Extra, John Kerry's memoir, which is terrific. And I'm like, I'm the guy who gets up at 3:30 or 4 in the morning, and I read most of it, and I read especially the chapter on the Middle East that you talked about, and you're featured in there. You're a key advisor to Secretary Kerry, and let me take everybody back, our listeners back to that period where 2013 there was already in the first Obama term an attempt by Senator Mitchell to actually try to produce results on the Israeli-Palestinian front. Didn't work. There were news reports at the time during the transition from Obama 1 to Obama 2 that they weren't going to prioritize the Israeli-Palestinian file. But your boss, your friend, John Kerry, said, no, we've got to prioritize this. You were part of, I assume, those deliberations and his efforts to prioritize that. Tell us why. Since it failed in the first term, why did he believe so strongly?
It's a great question, right? And Kerry's answer to that was, this is the last chance that we are ever going to have to solve this problem through negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. If we don't do this now, the facts on the ground are heading in exactly the opposite direction.
Right.
At some point, it's just no longer going to be a viable possibility to have two states. So he went to Obama and says the one thing he really asked of the president was, you got to give me an opportunity to try on Middle East peace. And I remember the first meeting I ever went to in the Situation Room I was the, I guess I literally just started as, I guess, like a deputy envoy at that point. Anyway, so Tony Blinken is the deputy national security advisor, and he pulls us all into the rooms, me and I think Bill Burns and David Hale. And anyway, so, we go through I explain, what Kerry's trying to do and how we're going to try to do it. And Tony says at the end of it, he's like, all right, Frank. And he'd been my predecessor as chief of staff of the Foreign Relations Commission. I've known Tony forever.
Yeah.
And he said, okay, just personally, I think we all understand that nobody around here actually thinks this is going to work, right? We just tried.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of schedule, but the president has given Kerry enough rope to, to pursue whatever those possibilities may be. I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
So I just have one question for you. What do you say to the argument that all of this needs to get a lot worse before it has any chance of really getting better? In other words, you'd have to have the entire collapse of the Palestinian Authority and then put much more burden of the occupation on Israel, the administrative burden, the military burden, the financial burden, the moral burden. And then maybe they'd start seeing the possibility of a two-state solution in a very different light.
Right.
And so I said to Tony, I was like, I think on a personal level, I think you're probably right. But that's not a policy for the United States. Right?
Yeah.
And I was like, just bluntly, you guys don't want to spend any time on this. I get that. This is your best bet for not having to worry about this.
Right.
As Dennis Ross used to say, the process is the peace.
Right.
As long as you had these negotiations. So Kerry his argument was, in effect, we have nothing to lose here, in terms of the day-to-day priorities of the administration. I'll do all the work. And we have a chance of resolving this conflict once and for all.
Was this before Obama went out and actually visited and gave a speech to the public? So this was all preparatory, just giving them a push.
This is probably March of 2013.
Yes.
Right. So it was exactly, 12 years ago.
Yeah.
And so, then Obama goes out and gives a speech, and he gave a speech in Israel, and we all went to Jordan together, and I met Kerry in Jordan, and we flew to Jerusalem to kick off the negotiations. And this really, as I look back on it, informed so much of what later happened. I wish I'd been able to internalize a little bit more clearly what is it. And so Kerry goes up to, it's me and Kerry and Prime Minister Netanyahu and Itzik Moho, who was his chief negotiator.
Yes.
And we meet him at the King David Hotel, and Bibi pulls us aside, and he's like, all right, John, I think there's a chance. I want to give this a chance, right? I know the president wants to give it a chance, but there's two things you need to know. The first is that the most I can ever do is probably less than the least a boss can ever accept. And what he was talking about was the politics of this issue. And then he said, and Kerry's like, all right, well, what's the second one? He's like, everybody in this region lies all the time, and you guys have a tendency in the United States to believe them. I remember I said, present company notwithstanding, of course. Netanyahu didn't smile at all. And I was like, all right, that's great. So there's no chance this is going to work, and you're going to lie to us every day. And we should have turned around and gotten on the field.
So your first lesson before was domestic politics matter and all of this. Second, in the Middle East, people don't say exactly what their true positions and stances are. They lie.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And also that really what I interpret Netanyahu as saying is this is about the politics of it. It's what can I sell my people versus what a boss can sell his people. And is there any overlap there? And that was very much our experience in the negotiations. At the end of it, I did not think that the problems were policy problems.
Right.
That even on security, we can go into some of the details if it's...
Yeah, sure.
We had intense negotiations on all of the main final status issues.
Yes.
At the end of the day, I don't think there was an answer on Jerusalem that was ever going to work for both sides. The rest of them I thought were solvable problems if you are actually willing to take a big risk politically in order to do it. And I just thought at the end of the day, neither side was anywhere near being willing to take the kind of risk that would have been required.
But let me ask you this, Netanyahu's argument there, and it made me think about one of my previous guests. About 2 years ago, I had Itamar Rabinovich. Before the October 7th attacks in 2023, we had him on this podcast, on the Middle East Focus podcast, and we were talking about his book. One of his key points was the dearth of leadership, where leaders who actually know where their population is at, and they're not there right now, but know that they need to move them forward and pull them forward. Do you think that Netanyahu and Abbas don't see that and don't have those qualities in the way that perhaps Anwar Sadat did, or Yitzhak Rabin, or others. Do you think that was one of the lessons that you were suffering from, is that there isn't true leadership? It's leaders who follow rather than take people to where they don't want to, where they need to go, but maybe where they don't want to go right now.
So that's an actual question, not a rhetorical.
Sorry.
Obvious. Neither one of them had any. Well, Abbas has no political support at all. There's been elections there and whatever, 20 years. And he's not a politician, Abbas. Like, he barely makes it out of Ramallah. So there's no way he was shaping, the perspective of his own. And they were really deeply cynical. They'd gone through this whole process of Oslo, never really implemented. And they had a series of negotiations. And at the end of the day, they wound up getting effectively nothing out of it, except for more and more stuff. So we had a deeply skeptical population and no political charisma, no ability. He didn't even try, right? But yeah, it would have taken a massive effort to get the Palestinians. Netanyahu, I just thought his politics from the time Rabin was killed and he was first elected prime minister, he said from the beginning, I'm not doing Oslo. He saw that his path to political prominence lay in opposition. He opposed the Sharon disengagement from Gaza. Right? He's been opposed to every single overture to really make peace with the Palestinians all the way along because it doesn't suit his politics.
Right.
And I'll tell you, my own personal view of it was that if the politics were different in Israel, if there's real support for a two-state solution there, that Netanyahu's a reasonable guy. He's a very smart guy. And having gone into great detail with him on a number of these different issues, I think if he had really wanted to, he could have sold the two-state solution to the Israeli public in a way that other Israeli leaders would not have been able to. So Nixon can go to China kind of problem. He just never aligned with his politics. And that's, at the end of the day, yes, he could have done much more to shape public opinion, to make it more conducive to the possibility of a negotiated outcome. But that was fundamentally counter to where his political base lay. And he was never willing to take that risk.
Right. So when I read Kerry's memoir in the chapter on the Middle East, the thing that struck me, two things. One, he's the Energizer bunny of this peace process. He's working harder maybe than you were or others. I don't know if you all work really hard. These are really hard jobs. But then second, and it's striking to me to read it here in 2025, he expresses so much empathy for the Palestinian people and had a sense of that. Maybe you were with him on some of the trips through the West Bank and through the occupied territories.
Everyone.
But this notion, which I've thought about and talked to some of our scholars here at the Middle East Institute, of humiliation, how, and in some ways, Trump actually uses humiliation as a tool, as a leader. Kerry was expressing empathy for this and trying to say, look, we actually are going to have bigger problems if we don't actually tap into the people, the Palestinian people, and help them improve their conditions and lives. And I don't know if that's a fair characterization.
100%, Brian. I think it's an important way to understand how Kerry approached this problem. And I'll tell you, the one moment that really crystallized in my mind was we went into Gaza Strip when Kerry was still chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. Right, so this is 2007 or thereabouts. After there was been a season, those were one ended, and we were in Israel, and Kerry wanted to go see what would happen and what it looked like in Gaza. And we were told by the ambassador, we will not support you going in there, like officially demarched. Or Kerry pulled the ambassador aside. He's like, "Come on, Jim Cunningham,
yeah,
I know what you're telling. Like, duly noted. But just between you and me, like, I want to go in there. Am I gonna get my ass shot off?" And Jim's like, "I'll probably be all right." So Hamas had no interest in they wanted to, they wanted Kerry to see. They didn't want him to be. So anyway, we went in there and took this incredible trip around. It was basically piles of rubble. And there was little girls playing on a big pile of rubble near a school that we visited. And I remember Kerry saying, like, this reminds me so much of Vietnam. Here we are, you're driving around, these kids just living in the midst of. So he really had the ability to empathize with the situation. And then we came back, and Abbas told him, there was pictures of Kerry in Gaza that were in the newspaper, and Abbas told Kerry, those pictures of you actually said, were worth a million words.
Yes.
So I think Kerry really got in his head. Again, he's trying to make a deal. The difference between the way Kerry approached it and the way I think Trump administration, we were trying to get both sides on the same page. And critical to that, in addition to understanding their political perspective, is to make clear to them that you understand what their people are going through. You can see this problem from their perspective. And so I think he really did try to see what, I remember we were going to the West Bank, and once we went and waited on the line at a checkpoint. Kerry's like, I want to see what it's like to be, to actually live in the West Bank. And we went and we stayed online, and we made our driver go stand online at a checkpoint. We're probably there about 20 minutes, half an hour, which is, they wait 4 hours.
Yeah, exactly.
Kerry's like, okay, I think I got the point, guys.
What I'm trying to roll through my head right now is here we are in 2025, and I listened to Steve Witkoff's interview with Tucker Carlson, which was interesting. And he actually went to Gaza and said that he was the first official, I think probably since Kerry went. And just the way he talks is my observation about the Palestinian people. It doesn't seem like he had saw the devastation, but he's also the envoy of a guy who essentially says all of those people have to get out.
Yeah.
And he's doubled down on that at points, Trump has. And then he also has said different things as he often does. But there isn't that feel of like a connection to the people there. Do you detect that as well? And I wonder why that is.
Well, I mean, I think Witkoff has done, honestly, some very good things, just considering how, and I was in his shoes. Witkoff had no experience working on any of this stuff.
Right.
Until he started doing this job. I had no direct experience, at that level in any event when I took the job. So I understand what it's like to step into the middle of this and just try to understand everything that's going on around you. So I don't fault Witkoff necessarily for not understanding. I know what the Palestinians. I think it takes years to really get that. You have to go talk to actual Palestinians. You have to go see this stuff where they don't know. But I think that the Trump administration's approach, writ large, is really to discount the will and the feelings of people that are on the other side of the negotiating table. And so I don't think Witkoff himself is necessarily should be held to account for not having a better feel for what it's actually like to be a Palestinian right now. But I do think that administration, the approach of we're not even going to listen to the other side in these negotiations is going to be very difficult to achieve their goals or anybody else's if you're just unwilling to listen.
But they sat down with Hamas.
Yeah, so they sat down with Hamas and they tried that out, and they heard what they heard from Hamas is this is what we want in return, and they're like, well, we're not doing any of that. And so, basically we're done with this whole conversation.
But that's what they said also to the Arab plan, I think, that came out in early March. They said, we're not interested in that, but we can continue to talk about it and things like this. So,
yeah, I think that the blowback on the Hamas stuff really did catch up with her. Bowler's no longer the hostage negotiator.
Yes.
That was, I don't know Bowler at all, but I did feel very badly for him because falling off the turnip truck in the middle of war in Gaza on Israeli TV has got to be anyone's worst nightmare. And again, these guys, they don't have experience. They don't understand, what they're stepping into in terms of the way the emotions in that region. So, to Trump, I think will have a very, very difficult time making any kind of a deal with Hamas if he's not willing to pressure the Israelis to make some significant concessions at this point. And I don't think there's any indication that he is willing to do that. And I'll tell you, Brian, that you're a policy guy around all this. Yeah. When you talk about implement the ceasefire, and there's easy talking points around all that. There's a problem at the heart of this.
What's that?
Right? Which is that Hamas still has 30,000 armed militants on the ground there. It was a flaw in the ceasefire from the very beginning. We do phase one, exchange prisoners for hostages. And then in phase two, we have a negotiation on ending the war, permanent IDF withdrawal, and a release of all the other options. I negotiated with John Kerry in 2014 a ceasefire agreement between Hamas and the Israelis, right? We actually succeeded in getting them to agree. It lasted all of 3 hours before it blew up. But it was humanitarian ceasefire. So it was a short-term pause with the idea that we'd use that pause to get at some of the underlying issues. It's
Right.
similar to what the Biden administration approach was and ostensibly what the Trump administration. The problem was Netanyahu had absolutely no interest in making any concessions to Hamas in any way, form, or fashion at that point or now.
Right.
So I just never thought there was a scenario where Bibi was going to say, yeah, okay, we'll pull the IDF out and we'll let, you guys have to agree not to govern and we'll bring in an interim technocratic government and international peace. But Hamas can say they won. They're still there. They're still there. And that, I just never thought there was a universe politically where that was going to be acceptable to Netanyahu. So I'm not surprised at all that the negotiations have ground to a halt now, because I just thought from the very beginning what Israel had actually agreed to was a 42-day ceasefire and the release of the remaining civilian hostages.
Yes.
They never agreed to
do
the
rest of this. Yeah. So I'd love to talk forever about like your experiences and all the stories and things like that. But when you look back on that unique period, 2013, 2014, what are your big picture lessons learned for the current moment? We talked a little bit about it. What did you guys get right? And you think, okay, we just should have continued and tried harder. What do you kick yourself about and say, oh, we really had that wrong when you think about this in that moment? And I know now is much different than that period then.
Yeah.
But in terms of negotiating tactics, regional engagement, and things like this.
Yeah. Well, obviously you look back and we failed. So I think there's plenty of things that we could have done differently. But I don't think any of them came close to having an impact on the final result. I don't think the parties were. You should go back and take a look, by the way, at the Obama framework and the London Track document.
Yes,
as you will see, our negotiations with the Israelis were in a totally different place than anybody could imagine right now. We're talking about the 67 lines. Again, it was always going to be an Obama plan that the Israelis would accept with reservations, but that was the premise of it, right? Security arrangements. John Allen had done an extraordinary job pulling together a huge team at the Pentagon to try to address it. So there was a lot of really interesting stuff in there that could have formed. But at the end of the day, as I said before, there was just no political will, right? Whether Netanyahu had done anything to shape the environment, that means. But the one lesson I took away from it is way too much to expect, right? The leaders of either one of these countries to take steps that are counter to their own political interest in order to try to advance a peace deal that requires some trust in the other side. So what does that lead to in terms of, okay, so what's the answer going forward? What I'd say is trying to do the big stuff all at once that's simply not going to work right now. I think that the best you can hope for right now, again, recognizing the politics and the policy and the security considerations and all the other things that go in this, is to try to stop the extreme right in Israel from literally making a two-state solution impossible. And it is pretty extraordinary underneath the radar. I was looking at Gaza, what Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir have done in the West Bank. They're on track to have 4 times more settlement units built in this year than in any other year previously. Wow. They have effectively extended civilian rule, Israeli domestic law, to the settlers inside of the West Bank, which is effectively, it's a de facto annexation. They haven't annexed territory, but they're treating the people there as if they were. So military rule applies to the Palestinians. Israeli civilian law applies to the settlers, right? And the process of building more and more outposts, of demolishing palaces, like that stuff, that whole process is going haywire right now. And Biden tried, his level best, sanctioned settlers in Amanah, which was a big deal. But it was the end, and it really had a marginal impact. And now that stuff is accelerating. So I think the best you can hope for right now is to try to isolate the extreme right in Israel by making clear. And Kerry tried to do this, especially in the last speech he gave. So like, this decision, people of Israel, is being made for you. Once it being made for you by an extreme group of right-wing zealots who are, when no one's looking, systematically making a two-state solution impossible. Like the best you could do right now would be to stop the bleeding there. But then also, I really do believe, going back to the original conversation I had with Blinken, Israelis need to see this problem in a different way than they do now. Because Netanyahu, this I think was in the book, he used to say to Kerry, John, take away all my excuses. And Kerry's like, okay, Frank, we just have to take away all those excuses. And list of 97 excuses. And I'm like, dude, you do realize there will always be another, and Livni's approach to it was, help us solve this problem. So it is only when the Israeli public, I think, comes to the conclusion that the alternative to giving the Palestinians some greater autonomy and territorial integrity than they have right now is this endless nightmare that turns into just a perpetual war, and then start to get public opinion saying we want an alternative to this, right? But you can't expect any Israeli leader right now to drive that conversation. I just don't think it's realistic.
What do you think about the outside in approach, meaning that you have these states, some who have agreements with Israel, some that Israel really wants the Saudi normalization accord? Is there some potential leverage there to actually say, look, your pathway to integration and normalization, and again, stipulate that probably the Trump team, I guess you would say you'd be skeptical that they'd be able to pull this off, or maybe not, because they have pretty warmer ties with MBS and some of the Gulf states than Biden ever did, even though it got better during his term. Do you see some possibility of that engagement, that opening, reshaping internal Israeli discussions, or no?
Yes, I do. I think it's the last best hope. You talked about the outside-in strategy. I don't buy that as a notion, because what the Israelis mean by the outside-in strategy is we make peace with all the Arab world, and then they bully the Palestinians into accepting whatever quarter of a loaf we're willing to give them.
Why won't that happen?
Well, I just don't think that because the Arab have their own politics. They're not like, you talk to MBS about this. Michael Ratney, our ambassador, I had a long conversation. Like, how do they actually look at this? They have their own politics in Saudi Arabia. They want to be the leader of the Arab world. You can't just sell out the Palestinians completely on this, let alone normalize relations with Israel and then bully effectively the Palestinians. So that part of and what it actually does is to say to the Israelis, hey, just keep on doing what you're doing.
Yes.
You'll get everything you ever want. You annex the West Bank, have normalization of relations, and everybody's going to forget about the Palestinians. So the whole concept of outside in, I thought flattered the darkest angels inside of the Israeli government in terms of, hey, we'll keep on doing what we're doing. Now, that being said, the idea of using Saudi normalization as leverage, right, to get the Israelis to take significant steps. And it was interesting, I thought, right after Trump came out with his Gaza Riviera plan, MBS said, to be clear, right, we will not be recognizing Israel and normalizing ours with them until there is a Palestinian state. Previously, it had been, there's a pathway to a Palestinian state, a credible pathway. And it was like, what's a credible pathway to a Palestinian state? Isn't that Oslo or the roadmap? There's no such thing. So the sense was that maybe the Saudis would take a soft touch in terms of what they actually were requiring.
Yes.
Now I think their position has really hardened on this. And that may be, if you really care about a two-state solution and you believe it is still possible, that is the last a bit of leverage that the international community, the Arab world, has over Israel. So if I were in charge of all of this, I would say to the Israelis, hey, look, this is great for you. It's great for the region. It's great for the United States. But it will require you to do some stuff that is unpopular politically with respect to the Palestinians. And you're going to have to do like transitions. Oslo called for the transition, Area C to Area B. These are irreversible, giving the Palestinians more land. I thought at an absolute minimum, you'd have to have some tangible, irreversible steps on the ground towards, at least implementing Oslo, if not moving closer to a two-state solution. So that's a long-winded way of saying, I don't think outside in, as the Israelis envision it, is going to work, but I do think the Saudi normalization bit provides a lot of leverage.
Yeah. So we didn't go down the memory lane as much as I'd like to. And there's a lot, especially in the book that Secretary Kerry wrote, and you're in it. In the interest of time, I want to move forward to some other questions I want to ask you before we run out of time. You were in the hot seat in a very senior position with Secretary Kerry at a time where a lot of Middle East issues, including Israel-Palestine, Iran, became deeply politicized, even more so than ever before. Yeah. And now I think we're in a completely different landscape in uncharted territory and things like that. And your central point is you got to listen to the politics in these places. Yeah. Even if it's dictators, they have to listen to the power balances in Syria when you're Assad and the leader there. How do you see the politics today on the question of Israel-Palestine? Where is it heading in our country right now? And how does a leader, basically, you said earlier also, Trump ignores this. He ignores the reality and does what he wants. But assume sort of a different leader, and you have to pay attention to this. Where are we, and where would you advise leaders to go on these questions?
Yeah, Brian, that's a great question. I think right now, it's really a shame that Israel has become a partisan issue, in effect, right? And everybody always wanted to avoid that. Dan Shapiro, I know, is on your show, recently always used to say, we can't let Israel become a political football between Democrats and Republicans. And I think that has certainly happened right now. I think even among American Jews, the majority of whom are Democrats, there's a real sense of like, I'm not with Netanyahu on any of this. So you see organizations like J Street are just increasing their emphasis. More and more people, Jews who are pro-Israel, but they don't want to be associated with Netanyahu and Trump, who are very much, similar to the creatures in their own mind. So you have the divide now politically in the United States over Israel between Democrats and Republicans in a way that you never had before. That's not good for Israel, and it's not good for the United States. So yeah, Trump is such a wild card in all of this, because he can come in. What if he were to come in and say to the Israelis, he won't probably do this, but he has the wherewithal to come in and say to the Israelis, I force you to accept this deal, allow Hamas to survive, get all the hostages out, or I'm cutting off all the weapons.
Right.
And so now suddenly you have a totally different universe that we're living in which things that were domestically impossible previously could theoretically be possible. I just don't think that's what's going to happen. I think we're going to continue to go down the path that now let the Israelis do whatever they want. He saw an opportunity to do a big thing for his legacy here. Now that's not going to work for the time being. I think he'll try to do normalization with Saudi Arabia and get the Nobel Peace Prize sometime in the second term. But for now, I think we're settled into a political divide over Israel that is really in no one's interest.
And Trump, ironically, got a lot of the conservative Jewish vote in 2024, but then he also picked up some Arab Americans in certain key states, right? Yeah. And it's an interesting, the map is all shuffled. I think the paradigms are all shuffled.
Yeah. The one thing I will say is that I think if they go back to war in Gaza Strip in the way in which I think they're currently planning to, which I think will result in, casualties that even exceed what we saw last time around, you're going to see protests in the streets that go beyond what you saw previously. And that's going to cause, I think, the Democratic Party to become further and further entrenched in opposition to Netanyahu and therefore, no longer aligned with Israel. And that, I think, is a dynamic that, it sort of feels inevitable at this point. That we're going to have further and further polarization around Israel on party lines.
Yeah. Last question, because we're coming to time. And I love asking everybody this question. How'd you get into this, Frank? What's your origin story? What motivated you to spend a big part of your adult life and career in this field?
Well, thank you. It goes back to my father was a diplomat, and we went to South Africa when I was 12 years old.
What year was that?
It would have been summer of 1979.
Wow.
So my father was had actually been asked by a bunch of South Africans to go to what was then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and to try to facilitate a peaceful transition. I think everybody knew white rule in Rhodesia wasn't going to. So the question was it going to be a violent overhaul or a political? My dad had a lot of experience. He'd worked quite a bit in Namibia, and so we took a trip that summer, and he spent half the time in Rhodesia. He had relationships with the tribes there as well. And he used to take us around to these. In South Africa, we went to, it was the whole summer. My parents were divorced at once, so we went to Soweto and we went to see Alan Payton and some of the reading. So I just got this incredible sense of the unfairness of us. And I remember flying home with my dad, and he said, "So Frank, what do you think?" I was like, "Well, basically something along the lines of, I think they should overthrow all the white people." I was 12. I was talking about, but it stuck in my mind. Then I had that bug at that point of these kind of challenges, problems, issues are what really animates me. Even at that age, I felt so alive. So I always wanted to.
And your dad, just tell us a little bit more. He's a legend. I mean, but tell our listeners.
So my dad was a congressman from New York. He was one of the leaders of the civil rights movement, but also really of the Dump Johnson movement. That's what my dad is most famous for. And actually, the crazy things about
President Johnson,
sitting Democratic president, war in Vietnam. My dad decides that we have to depose a sitting Democratic president because the war is unconscionable. So he gathers, and one of the people that he tried to get to be the candidate was Robert Kennedy. Oh, right. And it's interesting, when Robert K. Jr. just got sworn in as health secretary, he told the story of my dad and his dad. He's like, one of Robert Kennedy's best friends was my dad, with Al Lowenstein, and Lowenstein tried to convince him to come in and and be the candidate of the anti-war movement. And my dad said the time wasn't right. And then, Johnson drops out and my dad gets in. And you always admired Lowenstein so much for having the courage to say, hey, this is the right thing to do. And this is what needs to be done, even though the politics of that were very tricky. And he wrote an incredible note that, quoting Emerson, that Kennedy handed to my dad, was in his wallet, and my dad was killed. It's up on the wall in our house now. But anyway, so I had this background, and this experience, and so that's all I ever really wanted to do.
It's in your blood.
It's in my blood. And then
Then you went to law school.
And then I went to I went to go to law school, and I was a lawyer at a big law firm in Boston it's one of the biggest law firms in the world. I was miserable every day. I felt like the walls got a little smaller. I'd turn sideways to get into the office, and then the firm merged with another firm. And I remember I had a chance to take a buyout of the firm, and I went in and I still told the managing partners, everybody wishes they had him. I'm like, look, I wish you guys well. This is not my place. So I took a train down to Washington D.C. I went into Kerry's presidential campaign. The guy was doing intake there, and I'm
back in 2003.
So it's 2003. I was the first guy in the door on foreign policy, and I was like, I got a laptop. I don't need any money. Put me to work. And so from that point forward, I just, again, 35 years old I was at the time.
Wow,
I was
leap of faith.
About to become a partner. I just threw the whole thing out the window, tried to come down to Washington, start all over again. But to me, the risk was not coming down here. I always knew I'd go back to being a lawyer. The risk was continuing down a path that I would soon not be able to escape ever, and then I'd be leading somebody else's life.
Yeah, golden handcuffs, soul crushing.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, and what an amazing career you've had and will continue to have. I sense that this is in your blood, that you're gonna have an encore performance is my prediction. I don't know.
I hope so. Maybe you and me together.
Well, we'll see. You tried before, so maybe we can do it the next time around. But this was a fascinating discussion. I really appreciate you sharing your time and experience with us, but we're running out of time.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you, Frank, for being on the podcast. That's all the time we have this week. Again, thanks to our listeners for tuning in and to our colleagues for their work on this week's episode. You can follow us, MEI, on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for our latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Brian Katulis. We'll see you next time.